Well, I wanted to be a musketeer. I mean, I was young enough.
I couldn't pass any print without reading it.
You could come across a 7th century Cumbrian lullaby written in Old Welsh.
Angus, Thongs and Full-Frontal, Snogging, which is the funniest book I've ever read.
As a teenager, I adored Gone with the Wind.
Watercress was one of the great disappointments of life, when you grew up reading about everyone having watercress sandwiches and discover what it actually is.
I got serious about reading when I was about 8. We moved into a pub, and it was a beer house, really. And there was a very small flat upstairs above the pub. And I was on my own there a lot, because the pubs in those days were open 365 days a year, and my mother and father ran it downstairs, and I was upstairs. And my eyesight started to go, so I had to wear specs, which actually did change your character, made you change your character. Suddenly, instead of being this person who had a gang and ranged along and broke up wasps' nests and climbed trees, and I had these goggles on, these specs, these goggles on. And one of the things that they enabled me to do was to read more and read faster. So I read and read, and it became a complete addiction.
I remember this blue cover, and then inside, the title, Les Trois Mousquetaires, in fact, the Three Musketeers. And as soon as I began to read it, I just went into this extraordinary world of adventure and excitement. D'Artagnan was a Gascon, and I was in the Basque Country at the time, which is southwestern France. And the sort of border between Gascony and the Basque Country was quite vague. And in my mind, really, he was a Basque. And I think later I read that he might have been somewhat Basque. So it felt like another identification, someone who comes from this this waves, this backwater really, and then has all these adventures and goes to Paris and becomes a musketeer. And I think I just thought, this is what I want to do.
It's very interesting that I discovered from editing The Pleasure of Reading, quite a lot of writers drew attention to this element of enjoyable fear in their childhood, and I certainly agree with that. There's a book by E. Nesbit, who I think is still one of the most wonderful writers, called The Enchanted Castle. It's less well known than Five Children and It, really. And it's about some children who are rather bored in a country house. I don't know what's happened to the grown-ups, but they've vanished, and they decide to do a play, and they feel they need an audience, so they get all the grown-up coats, the tweed coats and the hats and the walking sticks, and they construct an audience. I can still see it in my mind's eye, over 70 years later, and they construct this audience, and they do the play, and then suddenly they hear the sound of clapping, and they look, and the people they constructed are clapping, and they call them the Ugly Wugglies, and the Ugly Wugglies sort of come to life and start pursuing them. I won't give away the end of the story.
It was a very big moment. I think it was probably about 14 or 15 when I read Midnight Children for the first time. And as I said, I'd been so accustomed to reading books set elsewhere that didn't really refer to the world around me. And when I started to read Midnight Children, both in its idiom, its historical reference points, its sort of linguistic and cultural specificity, it was of my world. I mean, the first part of it is in Bombay, but it's a very familiar kind of family, and it does later move to Karachi as well. And there was sort of this shock of recognition, which was the world I'm growing up in can also be a world that's written about in fiction, in the English language.
The book that has been particularly special to me, of the ones I've chosen, is Joan's book by Joan Littlewood, which is her autobiography about her time. Well, it's obviously about her life, but about her time running the theatre workshop, especially, which is an adventure, and it feels like a radiator. It makes you want to make really good theatre and really soulful theatre, and also it's really funny.
I do sometimes worry that I spend too much time reading. I started as a small child. I remember my parents complaining that when they took me on car journeys to the Highlands of Scotland, for example, I would just read 14 hours a day in the back of the car and refuse to look out of the window. That I carry a book with me when I go to meetings. I read in the back of any car, any train, any plane, any queue. I can't stand in a queue in the bank for more than 30 seconds without having a book in my hands.
I just couldn't understand how Chekhov did it. He moved so fast from one thing to another. I mean, rather like Shakespeare in that sense. You just, 4 pages into reading Shakespeare, so much has happened, and you go back, I didn't know, we got to there, we started there, and the speed of it was one thing that impressed me, and then, of course, the intensity and the deposit at the end of it, what Chekhov leaves you with. It leaves you with such a complication, still does now.
I really like books that take me to other countries. I mean, I think that's the best way very often to discover another country is by reading a book by an author. So I had a couple of years when I was reading Ismail Kadare, the Albanian writer, which I was fascinated by his books. And recently I've read Elena Ferrante, which are these wonderful books set in Naples, which I think are fantastic.
I think Harold introduced me to reading James Joyce. He adored Joyce, and he read it quite naturally and couldn't see the problem of obscurity. I mean, perhaps Harold Pinter finds it easier to understand James Joyce because their minds might be on the same line, but whatever the reason, he kept Ulysses by his bed, and I've still kept the copy there. So I hadn't, up till then, thought that I was the kind of person who would be able to read Joyce, and of course I read it. It was fascinating.
Today I'd go to, Ali Smith for the genius of her writing. I'd go to Nadeem Aslam, who writes often about Pakistan, but not necessarily the Pakistan I grew up in.
A play called A Taste of Honey by Sheila Delaney, which I think is just beautiful, which Joan Littlewood directed, and that is my #1 favourite play.
Oh, I know. Reading Lolita in Tehran, which is an absolutely wonderful book about reading Lolita in Tehran.
Gold by Dan Rhodes, which is also about disappointment in love. There's a theme here.
There's a slightly unsettling thing that I sometimes observe in myself, which is that I'll come back in a strange mood and I'll find myself looking at a bookshelf, hoping that there's going to be one book there which is going to address exactly the mood that I'm in. And that actually, I think, is in a way why I like Tristram Shandy, because there literally is no other book that I'm aware of that can cheer me up so profoundly, that make me feel so confident about what it means to be a human.